Okay, so my talk is about something called PostCAD, which is sort of a side project I've been working on for a while. Decided to kind of finally get it to a usable state, and so my goal is to have a demo by FOSDEM. And so I just wanted to kind of share the idea, kind of talk about a little bit about what it is, and try to get some feedback from people who might be interested. And so, sorry, this is my terrible attempt at a logo, kind of riffing on the Postgres elephant. He's got a gear and like a little drill and a scissors. It's terrible, but I just wanted something. So.
But you must keep it and fight for it forever. Yes. Never give it up, man.
Okay, yes, and so the idea here essentially is that we're going to take the lessons from the GIS ecosystem, Geospatial Information Systems ecosystem, and kind of just copy their work and get the benefits of it, the beauty of open source. And so this is the essential comment for that. I made this, you made this, I made this. So we're going to basically reuse their work. Especially one of the key things is that we're going to offload our data handling to database developers and kind of get some benefits from them. And so this is a real short presentation, but just real quickly, what is PostGIS? It's just a geospatial data types and operations, an extension for Postgres, the database. And so here's just some snippets. You just have like a select query where you have name and then you have the Aztec geometry. So this is just like a textual representation of geometry data. You've got a point and you've got two numbers for each one. So you have the geospatial data types, but also the operations. And so in this case, you're calling a function stArea on the geometry for the West Village neighborhood in New York City, and so you spit out a number from that operation. And so PostGIS is the root of an ecosystem. So you have GeoDjango, where people can make web APIs and web applications based on the CAD data or the GIS data and operations. You've got Spatialite, which is like instead of having a full database, you have a file as a database that also has spatial data. Leaflet.js, so you can sort of have fancy web applications with geospatial data. And then QGIS is really the key here because that's sort of a sister application or cousin application to FreeCAD. It's Qt-based, cross-platform, but instead of doing CAD, they're doing GIS. And so specifically, just another example, there's GeoAlchemy, which is sort of a Python wrapper on top of the PostGIS database. And so in this case, we have the definition of a table for a lake. So it's very simple. We just have sort of Postgres data, integer string, but then we have PostGIS specifically the geometry. And then we can do things like calculate the buffer area. So like, how much, what is the area if we have a buffer of 2 units around a lake? And so we can have the lake and then the result of the operation. So here's a quick screenshot of QGIS. And so specifically, I want to highlight this area here that I'm going to, in the next slide, show a blown up image of. But they have this browser. And so right here you can see, you've got your file system as like a source for data, but then you also have PostGIS, Spatialite, and then other databases. And even potentially you could have like web APIs and so forth. And so the idea there is that instead of just having all of the data in a document or in the file system, you can have data sources that are coming from multiple locations that are part of your document or even your workspace. And so if we have this PostCAD wrapper for Open Cascade, what can it do? So in a broader sense, if you think of like a food web and ecosystem, the idea is that if you make it easier for people to build a variety of applications on top of Open Cascade or other CAD libraries, you have more people who care about issues in it. And so indirectly, you're kind of going to increase the health of the entire ecosystem. But to be more specific, there's essentially, we're reusing all of the database work that's been done. So things like transactions, being able to lock a piece of geometry or something that if you're working on, someone else can't make changes to. You can do sort of all of the backup, duplication, deduplication stuff that's been, so much time has been put into by the database developers. You have a central place for analytics. So for example, if you have the CAD operations for your entire company all happening within sort of like a really beefy server, you can see what is taking long, what are people doing more often than others, like what are the workflows and so forth, and then also availability of data. So it's like if you have a disk fail, you don't have to worry about just making backups yourself. You have a central store of data, and it's being managed by people who that is their expertise. And so also sort of architectural change would be enabling a client-server model. And so the one benefit of that is that if you have an operation that would sort of lock down the interface, instead of having it be executed by FreeCAD, it would be handled by a separate process. And so maybe your machine would be under load, but you could still interact with FreeCAD. And there's other ways of solving that, but this is just one approach that also has a lot of other benefits. And so the idea, you could think of that is to build a task queue. So you click a button and maybe you can see that it's underway and the operation is going on, and maybe you can cancel it if you don't actually realize, you don't actually want to do it, or maybe you could wait and see what the result is. And so one of the big things with, one of the big benefits here is the idea of separating the document and the data. And so for example, if we do this, then we have sort of laid the groundwork for doing it in other ways. And so instead of, let's say, having our data in the database, we could also have a spreadsheet and pull in the data from that and integrate it into the workspace or the document in a separate way. So I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, does anyone have any questions or feedback about the idea of wrapping FreeCAD or Open Cascade in a database extension?
Lots of questions. Would you consider the analysis data that comes out of the CFD module or the FEM module to be something that you would want to do here also?
So in principle, it's possible. Right now, I guess the starting steps would be to just have all of the Open Cascade data types and operations or functions be available. But in principle, so for example, if you have your function that's being called by the client on the back end, instead of Open Cascade sort of answering questions, you could also have, let's say, BRLCAD handling an operation. And so you could kind of decouple sort of what library is handling it. And even one thing, I'm not sure if I had on the slide, but
you're going to take a speed penalty in this too, you know that, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so this also allows decoupling from Open Cascade versions. So instead of having one version that the client is specifically tied to, you can have, let's say, maybe backwards compatibility or more than one Open Cascade version. And another example is, let's say you have the database running locally on your machine and maybe one for your company. Imagine, like, let's say you check out some data, you insert it into your own local database so that you have better performance, and then once you are ready to submit your work, then you can send it off. But you also could have maybe both running at the same time, where things that are sort of higher priority are being handled locally, but then things that maybe like, let's say, speculative execution, like operations that are likely to happen after you've done something, you can maybe have that offloaded onto a remote machine or a more VP machine. Yeah, so the tricky part is that this is sort of a major re-architecting, but I think there's a lot of benefits, not just for FreeCAD, but for the ecosystem altogether. So
the database operations would tend to be happening any place that you are either recomputing or trying to create a preview of something. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the rest of the time, if you're just looking around your model and poking around, you're not making any database operations. It's when you add something new to your model or try to change it that you're suddenly going to need to make that round trip out.
Yeah, and so that's sort of the idea is that you can have the database running locally so that you don't have you don't have the network performance hit, but you can still have the decoupling of the client and the actual CAD application server that PostGIS would become if it had this extension.
Okay.
And it would be a lazy database in the sense that you would say, write this data, so you give it the operation to write, you can go on and do something else. It gets to it when it can.
Right. Yeah, and so it's tricky because you introduce it like asynchronicity, but at the same time, if you have a result that you kind of send out and are not dependent upon, you can, more easily, like you're kind of separating what you're working on and the operations.
And this is all SQL based too, is from what I was
saying.
saying.
Well, so there's layers to it. You would have sort of the direct SQL, queries and so forth. You could have the Python ORM on top of it, like the object relational mapper, sort of a higher level interface to the database. But then you also could have Python, like a REST API or other languages interfacing with it, and sort of higher level models as well. So for example, if someone wanted to make a very simple CAD application that had only really specific operations that they needed to do, they could just kind of worry about those versus, worry about those at the language that they're most comfortable with, like let's say JavaScript or something. Yeah, so that's my idea. It's kind of a big change, and I think having sort of some proof of concepts will help make it more clear, especially as far as like performance and stuff like that. But I think there's a big potential here.
What's your plan for the demo, proof of concept? What do you want to show?
So I think there's the bottle demo in the Open Cascade documentation where you have a bottle that is defined, sequence of operations and a set of parameters that create that, and then having basically those written in SQL so that you can write that code and then it'll return some sort of binary format for actually loading into FreeCAD, and then having that demo in SQL, but then also having it in sort of like, so a few slides back I had GeoDjango, so having sort of, GeoAlchemy, having sort of the Python wrapper on top of that so that you can write it in Python instead of doing it in SQL directly, and then maybe having a REST API on top of that, so that, for example, if you could have like a complicated curl command where you hit the API and you have sort of the sequences of the operations and the parameters that define the bottle, then the result of that is going to be like the binary representation you would load directly into FreeCAD. So kind of having the same multiple levels of interaction with the extension.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
You should have done this before we did topo naming.
Oh yeah, yeah. And so it's gonna be tricky.
Now it's your problem and not mine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of integrating this, dealing with it at C++, at the C++ level, and then the Python level is going to be tricky. So for example, if depending upon the level at which you interface with it, we may need to like start depending upon the Postgres query library in C++. But for Python, it'd be easier to kind of have proof of concepts.
Yeah, I was actually thinking more about the fact that you've got sort of two sets of data that now have to come back because you need the element histories as well if you want to support that piece.
Yeah.
So your query result now needs to have two segments in it,
Yeah.
the geometry part and the topo, and then the element history part.
Yeah, so just as an example of one potential application that I had in mind as far as the idea of sort of the local version of the database extension and then maybe a remote one. So imagine, let's say for example, you are starting to make a screw and you have some way of kind of detecting that is the process that you're going through, but maybe you are the details of like the threading or something like that. Let's say for example you could have a heuristic to say I'm probably going to be doing this type of threading and I may want the results of it, so maybe send that off to the remote server and it'll be ready if I do want to use it, kind of by the time I move my mouse around and click it, or go over to click it, it'll be, instead of having to, this is the speculative execution thing I was talking about, instead of having to wait after clicking, the operation is already done and the act of clicking the button to do that next step, the next common step of the model just loads that from sort of the result of the asynchronous operation. So.
I've been thinking about a lot of different projects for FreeCAD in terms of enablement rather than features.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's a way to where we could, at the core level within FreeCAD, not put anything about SQL in there, but enable so that you could put SQL in there.
Yes.
So that you have a common format of a way of writing a DLL or a shared library that could be called asynchronously based on the data in the core, so that you can have this rather than actually putting it into FreeCAD core itself.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You could just have like a thin Python client or something like that that has the objects, sort of things that look sort of more normal to someone who's used to writing FreeCAD Python, and then under the hood that deals with like hitting a REST API that has a SQL sort of already predefined in like a stored procedure or something like that. And then that way, the people who write FreeCAD Python don't have to care about it.
Or someone creates a version that works with, what's that free SQL that doesn't run SQL? The local file version.
SQLite. Yeah. So that's one of the examples is they have something like this for SQLite called Spatialite. And so you could kind of do the same thing. You have the benefits of like, local file performance and everything. So yeah.
So it's a Mongo version at some
I mean, I
point.
think it gets a little bit into the weeds, but it is kind of fundamentally to your point. It's probably about teasing the document objects away from the document
Mhm.
so that you can not have to rely on any characteristics of a file system-based document when doing operations on a list of document objects, which might come from wherever. They might still be on a file system document, or they might come from your SQL or whatever the case
And
is.
that's a good point too, is the idea of decoupling like your workspace and your data from the file system would also enable WebAssembly versions of FreeCAD.
There's a lot
because-
of things that could happen, and I think that's the split point, natural split point that you would get to on it. Because when we all operate in FreeCAD, we spend all of our time talking about, working on document objects and how they interrelate with each other. The fact that they all happen to be in the same document is the thing that's a little bit of the anachronism from the history of it being a desktop application.
Or like in discussion earlier about robotics, you can get your data from other CAD components. That's not even another database, but you can then, I'm just thinking out loud, yes.
So, I mean, you call this PostCAD,
Yeah.
but it's almost more post-OCC.
Well, and so I was just about to mention that, is that if you can produce, or you can present an Open Cascade equivalent interface, but then have the database actually call functions in some other CAD system. And so if you can figure out what the mapping is between like a BRL CAD operation and the Open Cascade operation, or any other sort of CAD system, then if the client doesn't need to know about it, then you can just swap it out without them knowing.
But I mean, if we're talking about like document objects, and what I want to do is I want to write a SQL query that returns a bill of materials. Right, let me select all the nuts and bolts across all the links and all this, but eliminate the ones that are in-house designed and filter by, an order by weight, or something like that. That's at the document object level, not at the OCC level.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So is that outside the scope of what you're talking about here?
At first, probably, but I think that it is extensible towards that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Although, not to get all technical, a relational database model is not really a good fit for a graph query language.
Right.
Would be a better fit for.
But Postgres has graph extensions, and so that's the ecosystem benefit, again, is that you have tons and tons and tons of work being poured into it about people who, their responsibility is data. And so this kind of touches on something else I've talked about in terms of trying to incorporate code from KDE, the KDE project. All these people are using Qt and they are worrying about interface and design and all that stuff. If we can focus on the CAD aspect and have other projects, use other projects' work for interface, use other projects' work for data management, then we can kind of focus on our core capabilities. So. Yeah, it's 12:01. Any other questions?